19th November 1942, Northern Steppe, 150 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad. Major Ion Dumitrescu of the Romanian Third Army stood in his command bunker, listening to something that didn't belong in the frozen darkness before dawn. It started as a distant rumble, like summer thunder rolling across the steppe, but this was no storm. The sound grew louder, deeper, until the earth itself began to tremble beneath his boots. He grabbed his binoculars and rushed outside into the -18-degree cold. What he saw on the horizon made his blood freeze colder than the Russian winter. The sky was turning orange, not from sunrise, but from the muzzle flashes of thousands of artillery pieces firing in unison. For 80 minutes, the world became fire and thunder. Soviet shells screamed overhead in waves, obliterating Romanian defensive positions, command posts, communication trenches. Men who had been sleeping moments ago simply ceased to exist, vaporized by direct hits or buried alive in collapsing bunkers. Through his binoculars, Dumitrescu watched his entire defensive line disappear into clouds of smoke, earth, and flame. Then, through the smoke, he saw them, hundreds of T-34 tanks emerging like steel ghosts from the snow, their engines roaring, their cannons firing, advancing in a seemingly endless tide. Behind them came wave after wave of Soviet infantry, tens of thousands of men with fixed bayonets, shouting "Ura!" and charging toward what remained of his defenses. Dumitrescu reached for his radio to call for German reinforcements, but the line was dead. Everything was dead. The trap was closing, and the German Sixth Army, trapped in Stalingrad, had no idea they were about to be surrounded. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done facing the massive Soviet counteroffensive that changed the course of World War II? To understand how the Soviet counterattack at Stalingrad crushed Hitler's ambitions, we must first understand how desperately close Germany came to victory in that frozen city. By mid-November 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, over 270,000 battle-hardened Wehrmacht soldiers, had pushed Soviet defenders into a narrow strip of ruins along the Volga River, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide. German soldiers could literally see the river. They could watch Soviet supply boats making their desperate crossings under fire. Victory seemed tantalizingly, impossibly close. Just one more assault, one more push, and Stalingrad would fall. The city that bore Stalin's name had become an inferno of close-quarters combat unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. For 3 months, German and Soviet forces had fought building by building, room by room, staircase by staircase. Places like Pavlov's house, the grain elevator, and the Red October factory had become legendary killing grounds, where battles for single structures lasted weeks and consumed thousands of lives. The Luftwaffe had reduced Stalingrad to skeletal ruins, but those ruins became a defender's paradise where German advantages in armor and air power meant little. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, had implemented a brutal but effective strategy: hug the Germans. Soviet soldiers stayed so close to enemy positions that German artillery and bombers couldn't fire without hitting their own men. Every pile of rubble became a fortress. Every basement became a bunker. The fighting was savage, personal, and absolutely merciless. Both sides were exhausted, depleted, bleeding from thousands of cuts. But while German commanders remained fixated on the street fighting in Stalingrad's ruins, blind to everything except the immediate tactical situation, Soviet strategic planners were preparing something unprecedented. A counteroffensive so massive, so audacious, that it would trap an entire German army and mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East. The architect of this plan was General Georgy Zhukov, the man who had saved Moscow the previous winter and was now Stalin's most trusted military commander. Zhukov studied maps and intelligence reports from his headquarters hundreds of kilometers from Stalingrad and saw what the Germans, obsessed with their street-by-street advance, had completely missed: vulnerability. The Sixth Army's flanks, stretching for hundreds of kilometers north and south of Stalingrad, were held not by elite German troops, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian Allied armies. These forces were less experienced, poorly equipped, and increasingly demoralized. Their defensive positions were thinly spread. Their anti-tank weapons were obsolete. Many soldiers questioned why they were fighting Russia at all. Zhukov proposed Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment that would smash through these weak flanks simultaneously from north and south, then link up behind Stalingrad, encircling the entire German army in a steel trap. It was an enormously ambitious plan, requiring over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft, all assembled in secret and launched in perfect coordination across hundreds of kilometers of front. Stalin approved the operation on 13th November, setting the start date for 19th November in the north and 20th November in the south. The countdown to Germany's greatest defeat had begun. The scale of deception required for Operation Uranus was staggering. Over 1 million Soviet troops had to be moved into position without German intelligence detecting the buildup. The Soviets employed maskirovka, military deception, on an unprecedented scale. All troop movements happened exclusively at night, with units traveling without lights and under strict radio silence. Tank engines were muffled. Artillery was camouflaged under netting and fake vegetation. Dummy tank formations were created north of Moscow to suggest a completely different offensive axis, drawing German attention away from Stalingrad. Partisans sabotaged German reconnaissance flights and attacked communication lines. Soviet officers used every trick imaginable to maintain secrecy. Infantry units marched for kilometers through freezing cold, forbidden from lighting fires that might reveal their positions. Tank crews were not told their actual objectives until hours before the attack. Even frontline commanders received only portions of the overall plan. False radio traffic suggested Soviet forces were preparing defensive positions, not massing for attack. Meanwhile, German intelligence failed catastrophically. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were limited by weather and fuel shortages. German commanders, confident that the Soviets were too weak and disorganized to launch major operations, dismissed reports of Soviet buildup as exaggerations. They believed the Red Army was barely holding on in Stalingrad itself. How could they possibly be preparing a massive counteroffensive? This fatal underestimation would cost Germany an entire army. By 18th November, everything was in position. Soviet artillery batteries, thousands of them, were dug in and loaded. Tank units were fueled and ready. Infantry divisions had moved into their jump-off positions. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius. Snow fell steadily across the frozen steppe. In the early morning hours of 19th November, Soviet commanders synchronized their watches and waited for the order to commence the largest coordinated offensive the Eastern Front had yet seen.
At exactly 7:20 a.m. on 19th November 1942, hell erupted. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front northwest of Stalingrad. The sound was indescribable. a rolling, continuous thunder that could be heard 50 kilometers away. The ground shook violently. German and Romanian soldiers in their positions thought the world was ending. For 80 minutes, the barrage continued without pause, methodically destroying everything in its path. Romanian defensive positions, trenches, and bunkers were pulverized. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were obliterated. Artillery positions were counter-batteried and destroyed. Soldiers who survived the initial barrage emerged from their shelters in shock, deafened, disoriented, unable to communicate or coordinate. Many Romanian units ceased to exist as cohesive fighting formations in the first hour. Then, at 8:50 a.m., the Soviet armor attacked. The 1st Tank Corps, the 26th Tank Corps, and the 4th Tank Corps spearheaded the northern attack. They crashed through Romanian positions at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour, bypassing strongpoints, cutting communication lines, driving deep into the German rear. Romanian soldiers who stood and fought were overwhelmed. Many others fled or surrendered immediately. The anti-tank guns they possessed, mostly outdated 37mm pieces from World War I, were useless. Shells simply bounced off T-34 armor at any range beyond point blank. Behind the tanks came the Soviet rifle divisions. Thousands upon thousands of infantrymen advancing in waves, shouting their traditional battle cry, "Ura!" and shooting or bayoneting any Romanian or German soldiers who resisted. The Soviet tactics were brutal and effective. Isolate strong points, bypass them if possible, destroy them if necessary, but always keep moving forward, always maintain momentum, always drive toward the objective. German reserves attempted to respond, but they were too few, too scattered, and too slow. Panzer divisions that should have been able to maneuver rapidly found themselves critically short of fuel. The Wehrmacht had prioritized fuel deliveries for units fighting inside Stalingrad itself. Some Panzer III and IV tanks literally ran out of fuel trying to reach the breakthrough points. Their crews had to abandon them where they stood, leaving dozens of operational tanks sitting immobile on the steppe like useless sculptures. The 22nd Panzer Division, one of the few German armored units in the area, attempted a counterattack on the afternoon of 19th November. They collided with Soviet tank forces in a confused engagement, fought in snow and fog. The Germans were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Within hours, the 22nd Panzer Division had lost half its tanks and was withdrawing in disorder. The northern pincer continued its relentless advance southwest toward the Don River and beyond. One German officer who witnessed the collapse later wrote, "It was like watching a dam break. One moment our Romanian allies held the line. The next moment there was no line, just thousands of Soviet tanks and infantry pouring through a gap that widened with every passing hour. We threw everything we had at them, but it was like trying to stop the ocean with sandbags." The next day, 20th November, the nightmare repeated in the south. South of Stalingrad, the 51st Army and 57th Army launched their own massive assault, this time against the Romanian 4th Army and the south flank of the German 6th Army. The pattern was identical, a devastating artillery barrage that pulverized defensive positions, followed by waves of T-34 and KV-1 tanks supported by infantry. The Romanian 4th Army, like its counterpart in the north, was simply not equipped to stop modern armored warfare. Their soldiers were brave enough, but bravery couldn't compensate for obsolete weapons and inadequate training. Soviet tanks broke through their lines within hours. Romanian units disintegrated. Some retreated in good order, others panicked and fled. Many simply surrendered, seeing no point in dying for a German war of conquest. German commanders finally began to understand the magnitude of the disaster. This wasn't a local counterattack or a spoiling attack. This was a massive, coordinated offensive designed to encircle the 6th Army. Frantic messages were sent to Wehrmacht High Command requesting permission for Paulus to withdraw the 6th Army from Stalingrad while there was still time, while an escape route still existed. But Adolf Hitler, sitting in his headquarters thousands of kilometers away in East Prussia, refused to consider retreat. He had publicly announced that Stalingrad would fall. German newsreels had shown confident soldiers raising swastika flags over captured buildings. Propaganda Minister Goebbels had declared Stalingrad a great victory in progress. To retreat now would be to admit failure, to show weakness, to undermine the entire Nazi narrative of German invincibility. On 22 November, Hitler sent a direct order to Paulus. The Sixth Army will stand fast. It will not withdraw one step from the Volga. The Luftwaffe will supply the army by air until relief forces arrive. It was a death sentence disguised as an order. That same day, 23 November, the two Soviet pincers met near the town of Kalach on the Don River, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Tank crews from the northern and southern forces embraced each other in the snow, celebrating the successful link-up. Radio operators transmitted coded messages to Moscow. The ring is closed. The enemy is trapped. The encirclement was complete. The entire 6th German Army, over 290,000 soldiers, along with remnants of Romanian divisions, Croatian auxiliaries, and various support units, were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. They were cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any hope of immediate relief. And winter was just beginning. Inside the pocket, the initial German reaction was confusion rather than panic. Many officers and soldiers had experienced encirclement before, at Demyansk and Holm earlier in 1942, and had been successfully supplied by air until ground forces broke the siege. Wehrmacht propaganda had always emphasized German resilience, flexibility, and the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Surely this situation was temporary. Surely relief forces would break through. Surely the Luftwaffe could keep them supplied. These assumptions were catastrophically wrong.
Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most powerful subordinates, personally assured the Führer that his air force could supply the trapped Sixth Army. Paulus's quartermaster had calculated that they needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies daily to sustain the army: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, winter clothing, and fodder for the thousands of horses used to pull artillery and supply wagons. Göring claimed the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons per day. He cited the Demyansk airlift as proof of concept. His staff officers, who knew the claim was impossible, were overruled or ignored. Hitler, desperate for good news and willing to believe anything that avoided admitting a catastrophic strategic failure, accepted Göring's assurance. The reality was that the Luftwaffe never came close to delivering 500 tons daily. The distances were too great, over 200 kilometers from the nearest German-controlled airfields. The weather was too unpredictable, with frequent blizzards, fog, and snowstorms that grounded aircraft for days at a time. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Log-3s, and American-supplied P-39 Airacobras patrolled the air corridors relentlessly, hunting the slow, lumbering Junkers U-52 transport aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket with hundreds of guns, turning the approaches to Stalingrad's airfields into killing zones. The primary transport aircraft, the Junkers U-52, was designed for cargo operations, not for flying through blizzards and fighter screens. They were slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable. Soviet fighter pilots called hunting them shooting geese. On good days, the airlift delivered perhaps 100 tons of supplies. On average days, 50 tons or less. On many days, nothing arrived at all. Over the next 10 weeks, the Luftwaffe would lose over 500 transport aircraft trying to supply the Sixth Army. Planes shot down by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, crashed in blizzards, or lost to mechanical failures in extreme cold. Inside the pocket, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Soldiers' daily rations were cut to 300 grams of bread per day, less than a fist-sized portion, then 200 grams. By late December, 100 grams, a slice smaller than a playing card. Meat disappeared entirely. Vegetables became a distant memory. Coffee was replaced by roasted acorns. The Sixth Army's 30,000 horses were systematically slaughtered for food. Soldiers ate horsemeat stew, then horsemeat without cooking when fuel ran out. When the horses were gone, they boiled leather belts, chewed frozen grass, scraped frost from walls to drink water. Starvation ravaged the army. Men who had been strong, healthy soldiers just weeks earlier became skeletal. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their skin turned gray. They moved slowly, mechanically, conserving every calorie. Medical officers recorded cases of soldiers too weak to lift their rifles, too exhausted to walk 100 meters without rest. But the cold was worse than the hunger. December brought temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, then minus 35, then minus 40 on the worst nights. German soldiers were still wearing standard wool uniforms designed for Central European weather, not Siberian winter. They had no proper winter coats, no insulated boots, no cold weather gear. The Wehrmacht had sent them to fight a summer campaign that was supposed to end before winter arrived. Frostbite became epidemic. Toes and fingers turned black with necrosis. Ears and noses fell off. Men wrapped their feet in newspaper and rags, but nothing helped. Field hospitals overflowed with frostbite casualties. Surgeons performed amputations by candlelight, without anesthesia, sawing through frozen tissue while patients screamed or died from shock. Those who survived the amputations often died from infection days later. One Wehrmacht doctor wrote in his journal, "We are not treating soldiers anymore. We are watching them die slowly, one piece at a time. First their toes, then their feet, then gangrene spreads and kills them. I have no medicine, no bandages, no anesthesia. All I can do is watch and wait for death to be merciful." Fuel was so scarce that vehicles sat frozen and abandoned. Tanks became shelters for their crews. Artillery couldn't be moved or fired. Soldiers burned furniture, then structural timbers, then anything flammable. When wood ran out, they tried burning frozen corpses soaked in precious fuel. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Men watched their friends die slowly from starvation and cold. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast propaganda in German, promising food and warmth for those who surrendered. Letters from home described Christmas celebrations and warm houses, letters describing a world that no longer seemed real. Meanwhile, outside the pocket, the Red Army tightened its grip. Soviet forces attacked constantly, pushing the perimeter inward, capturing the airfields that were the pocket's lifeline. The airfield at Pitomnik was captured on 16 January 1943. The last remaining airfield at Gumrak was captured on 22 January 1943. Now, even the inadequate trickle of supplies stopped completely. The German military launched one desperate attempt to break the siege, Operation Winter Storm. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, assembled a relief force built around the 6th Panzer Division and 23rd Panzer Division and attacked toward Stalingrad from the southwest on 12 December 1942. The relief force drove to within 48 kilometers of the pocket before being stopped by fierce Soviet resistance. Manstein sent urgent messages to Paulus. Break out now, while the relief force creates a corridor, while there is still time. But Hitler's orders were absolute. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Paulus, a loyal, obedient officer who had never disobeyed an order in his life, refused to break out without Hitler's permission. Days passed. Soviet forces reinforced their positions. The relief effort stalled, then collapsed. By Christmas, Operation Winter Storm had failed. The corridor to freedom that briefly existed had closed. The Sixth Army was doomed. By late January 1943, the pocket had been compressed to a fraction of its original size. Over 100,000 German soldiers were already dead from combat, starvation, or cold. The survivors were hollow-eyed ghosts, many too weak to hold their weapons. Soviet forces attacked constantly, using massive artillery barrages, followed by tank infantry assaults that German defenders, starving and freezing, could barely resist. On 30th January 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a radio message, a calculated move since no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to fight to death or commit suicide. But Paulus, surrounded by dying men in a basement headquarters, facing the reality of total defeat, made a different choice. On 31st January 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the pocket to Soviet forces. On 2nd February, the northern pocket also surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Sixth Army, one of Nazi Germany's elite formations, had been completely destroyed. Of the 290,000 Germans encircled in November, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. They were skeletal, disease-ridden, frost-bitten wrecks of men. Most weighed less than 50 kilograms. Many could barely walk. Soviet POW camps, themselves struggling with limited resources, became death camps. Over the following months and years, approximately 85,000 of these prisoners died from typhus, dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated injuries. Only about 6,000 German soldiers who entered the Stalingrad pocket ever saw Germany again. The Soviet victory came at an enormous cost. Estimates suggest approximately 478,000 Soviet soldiers died during the battle, with over 1 million wounded. Civilian casualties approached 50,000. The city of Stalingrad was utterly destroyed. Not a single building remained intact. The Volga River was choked with debris and bodies. The ruins were so contaminated with unexploded ordnance and human remains that full clearance took years. But the strategic and psychological impact was world-changing. Germany had lost an entire army. 22 divisions simply ceased to exist. The material losses were staggering. 900 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, 6,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 vehicles, all gone. More importantly, the myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht, which had terrorized Europe with seemingly unstoppable blitzkrieg tactics, had been stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II's Eastern Front. Before Stalingrad, Nazi Germany was advancing, conquering, seemingly unstoppable. After Stalingrad, Germany was on the defensive, retreating westward across thousands of kilometers, fighting a war of attrition it could not win. The genius of Operation Uranus lay not in tactical innovation, but in strategic vision and execution. Zhukov and the Soviet High Command had recognized German overextension, identified the weak points in their defensive line, and assembled overwhelming force to exploit those vulnerabilities. They had maintained operational security despite moving over 1 million men and thousands of vehicles. They had coordinated attacks across hundreds of kilometers of front with precision timing. They had turned German tactical success in Stalingrad into strategic catastrophe. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat proved catastrophic. His insistence that the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad, regardless of circumstances, transformed a dangerous situation into total disaster. A competent commander would have ordered Paulus to break out when the encirclement first formed, accepting the loss of equipment, but saving the trained manpower. Instead, Hitler's hubris and Göring's false promises condemned an entire army to death. The Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated that the Soviet Union could not only resist German aggression, but could plan and execute sophisticated offensive operations. Soviet industry, relocated beyond the Urals, was producing tanks and artillery faster than Germany could replace losses. Soviet commanders had learned from early defeats and developed effective combined arms tactics. Most importantly, the Soviet people showed they would endure unimaginable suffering to defend their homeland. For Germany, Stalingrad was the beginning of the end. The loss of the Sixth Army created a manpower crisis that could never be fully addressed. The subsequent Soviet offensives would drive German forces back across Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. Every major battle after Stalingrad saw German forces retreating, trading space for time, unable to regain the initiative. Today, 80 years after the battle, Stalingrad has been rebuilt as Volgograd. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands repeatedly during the street fighting, is crowned with "The Motherland Calls," an 85-meter statue of a woman holding a sword aloft, symbolizing Russia's defense against invasion. Around the statue are memorials listing the names of defenders. In the soil beneath, workers still occasionally find relics, bullets, helmets, bones. The earth itself is a memorial. Major Ion Dumitrescu, the Romanian officer who witnessed the opening barrage of Operation Uranus, survived the encirclement and Soviet captivity. He returned to Romania in 1948, lived quietly, and never spoke publicly about Stalingrad. Years later, his grandson found his diary, which ended with a simple entry dated 23 November 1942. "The trap has closed. God help those inside." The soldiers who died at Stalingrad, German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, died because their leaders made strategic decisions without fully understanding the consequences. Hitler's ambition to conquer the Soviet Union, capture the Caucasus oil fields, and humiliate Stalin led directly to the encirclement and destruction of his finest army. The Soviet counterattack didn't just crush Hitler's ambitions at Stalingrad. It broke the back of German offensive capability in the east and began the long, bloody road to Berlin. The Battle of Stalingrad proved that the Soviet Union proved that the modern warfare is decided not by tactical brilliance alone, but by logistics, industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic vision. Germany possessed the first. The Soviet Union possessed all the others. In the frozen ruins of one Russian city, that mathematical reality became undeniable. The Wehrmacht would never fully recover. The Red Army would never stop advancing. Operation Uranus succeeded because it exploited fundamental weaknesses in German strategic planning: overextended supply lines, reliance on unreliable Allied armies, underestimation of Soviet capabilities, and Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. The Soviet counterattack demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved from the disorganized force of 1941 into a sophisticated military machine, capable of planning and executing complex operations. From Stalingrad forward, the strategic initiative belonged to the Soviet Union. But while the Soviet Union crushed Hitler's ambitions in the East, another front was opening in the West, where Allied forces would begin the long campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa that marked America's entry into the ground war against the Axis powers and set the stage for the eventual liberation of Europe.